We Care. I'm a therapist at We Care Services for Children, and I have been at We Care this year will make 20 years. So I've been working with young children, birth to 6, for most of my professional life. And the presentation I'm going to do today is about the impact of violence and also incorporating that in terms of relationships, but on intergenerational trauma. And I guess it's a lot of information. It's complex, it's charged, and I just want you to know that we will be doing something mindfulness based at beginning, middle, and end to support our nervous systems. Because I know that some of this experience may be your lived experience or the lived experience of people you care about. And that's hard and potentially activating to your body, your nervous system. So I will attempt to do things throughout to help us re-regulate. I guess if I had to tell you what the 3 kind of key takeaways today would be, it would be that safety is treatment, that behavior in young children is communicating their sense of safety, and caregivers' behavior either supports developing a sense of safety or it doesn't. So that's going to be our threads as we go through covering the material today. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay. All right. So I want to acknowledge that in a few weeks, officially the government's going to lift the COVID emergency. But that even though that is changing our narrative, that there isn't an emergency, that families are still being impacted. I definitely am working with families that struggle with not having sick time or childcare, or if a preschool shuts down, they have to take time off. And depending on the constellation of the family, they may not have extended family or a partner. So there isn't someone else to help. And they may also, I have found families that the people that they are close to are in similar circumstances. So there isn't someone like working at home who can take care of a child. So it's still hard for families, even though we're seeing that the emergency is lifted. So today, the structure of this presentation is to first overview trauma, and that will involve both the science of it and how it may impact kids depending on a variety of factors, as well as the historical context of violence in the United States and trauma and how that impacts children.
Roxanne, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but in the chat, we're getting that we are not able to hear you.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, so the volume was a little low, but we can hear you now.
Okay.
Thank you.
So if I don't hold the mic and I just put it down, can you hear me? Can you still hear me now? The same?
We'll see what yes, the chat is saying yes. Thank you.
Okay. So to recap, today we're going to overview trauma, both the science of it, contextual factors that impact how trauma impacts kids, and the historical context of trauma for kids in the US. And we will talk about how babies and young children experience interpersonal violence. I'm going to use some of my case examples, and we'll talk about how we can be of support. So to begin, I want to start us off with a mindfulness exercise, and we are going to be talking about trauma and violence, which involves a lack of safety. And safety, I'm defining as something very multifaceted. It's both and. It is our ability to feel secure and vulnerable at the same time, that our needs are going to be met even if we are vulnerable. It's physical, in that, do I have is my body free from injury? Do I have shelter? It's relational, Do I have people that care about me and my well-being? And it's material. Do I have enough food and clean air and water to feel regulated in my body? So to start us off, I want us to both do centering and resourcing, and I'm hopeful that you can draw upon this throughout the presentation today. So a resource is anything that enhances your feeling of vitality or strength or nurture. And so it can be relationships, your pets, your religious beliefs, your creative ability, poetry, anything. I have a rose on here because roses are one of my resources. And for my family's story of trauma and resource, I am from the US Virgin Islands, and my great-great-grandmother Emily immigrated there with 10 children because her husband had fallen off a roof and they were on Guadeloupe, and he was the breadwinner and he became disabled. And she had 10 kids and she didn't know what she was going to do. So she relocated to St. Thomas because she had a brother that lived there. And she moved there and basically became a farmer. And my grandmother was raised by her because my grandmother's mother had schizophrenia and wasn't able to care for kids. So I asked my grandma, how did Emily do it? She had so many children. She didn't know English. It was so much strain. How did she not lose it? And she's like, well, she really always took a little space away from the house. She had a little patch of roses and she would go there to pray. And every day we knew that when she went there to leave her alone. And so she would go there to pray every day, to be connected to God and beauty and nature, and it helped to sustain her. So even though I never met Emily, I feel a sense of strength and connection spiritually and to my people. So this is a resource for me. So if you aren't able to think of a resource in the moment, you can use this one. So here we go. I would invite you to get in a position where you feel comfortable, and close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And if not, find somewhere to gaze that's not distracting to you. And just notice how your body feels before we start. And invite you to place one hand on your heart and another on your belly, just below your rib cage. And just for a moment, just sense the weight of your hands on your body and notice the warmth of your hands and the movement of the breath happening under your hands. Now I invite you to bring to mind your resource and just explore it in your mind a little bit. Are there sounds that go with this resource? Is there a scent? Can you taste anything from this resource?
Sorry, show me.
Roxanne, sorry about that, but you're muted. Can you unmute yourself, please?
All right. As you bring to mind this resource, just notice what is happening in the senses. Are there any sounds or smells? Is any happening with touch in your body? And just notice changes in your posture. Does your facial expression change when you think of this resource? And your bodily tension? What thoughts and feelings come up as you make meaning of this resource? And we're going to end by doing 3 deep breaths, and I'm going to count for us. Let's inhale and exhale. Let's inhale and exhale. Let's inhale and exhale. You can open your eyes as we gently release this practice. So let's begin by defining trauma. Trauma is a nervous system response to both a real threat or a perceived threat to physical or emotional well-being. It's not defined by the event, which we often think of like this thing happened, but it's really what's happened in the body. In addition to what happens in the body, psychologically, how we understand ourselves and our worlds often changes. Excuse me. Our trust is often impacted because most of the time trauma is happening from others or systems set up by others. Our vulnerability is increased usually, and there's usually a sense of powerlessness. So as we're going to talk about things that are more fear-based, I want to talk about what's typically a fears that we have as we are developing as young people. We normally have 4 developmental fears, and these happen throughout our lifespan. But what is happening when we are little impacts how we then respond to these same kinds of fears as we get older. So from 8 to 24 months, we have a fear of separation. From 18 to 36 months, we fear losing love. And from 12 to 36 months, we have fear of bodily damage. And from 36 months to 5 years, we introduce the fear of being bad or beginning of moral conscience. So these are fears that are our typical experience. And you can imagine, like for young children who may be removed from within the foster care system, how many of these get activated early. You know, they're losing an attachment figure, they're losing love. Maybe they got hurt and that's why they're being removed. Maybe they think they're bad because little kids are often believed that they are doing things that are controlling the world. So all of these can echo forward as they developed, as we all develop. This happens for all of us, in just our experiences and inform our context of how we understand the world. So there are both child factors and contextual factors that impact how much trauma will affect the child. So the child factors are the age of the child, and that is because of the level of brain development and the stage of dependency. People often say, oh, they won't remember, they'll forget about it. But the truth is that the younger a child is, the more impactful trauma can be, because they don't have the same cognitive and coping resources. And in terms of brain development, from the last trimester of pregnancy to 3, we have the most rapid brain growth in terms of early childhood. And so if you have things happening to you, then you're wiring differently. And we'll talk more about that. In the constitution of the child, what happened in utero? Was there drug exposure or domestic violence happening when the mom was pregnant? Those things do impact because cortisol crosses the placenta, and it impacts how the nervous system then develops of a child. What is that child's genetics? What are their predispositions and their temperament? Are they a child that's maybe more easygoing or maybe more sensitive? You know, they will have a different interpretation of events because of how their nervous systems just are. And then what are the child's skills and capabilities at the time of a trauma? If you can talk and run and make sense of things and have some sense of agency, you're going to have more a sense of I have a way out, or I have control. But if you're younger and younger, you have less of those skills and capabilities. If there's been previous trauma that sets someone up for being maybe more afraid, and having more nervous system activation. The contextual factors, what was the frequency, duration, and nature of the trauma? Anything that happened more is going to be more impactful because the stress response is going to continually be turned on. And if the nature of the trauma is one where, for example, it's sexual in nature and it's someone close to the child, like a parent or a sibling, it's more impactful than a stranger because there's a violation of trust and understanding of boundaries. And the level of invasiveness matters because if your boundaries keep getting violated, you learn that what you think and feel doesn't matter. And then it sets you up later for difficulties in relationships to either push off a bully or a predator, or even in limit setting with your kids later. I see this with parents that I work with. The degree of violence, how much is their impact to the body? Systemic inequity is also pretty significant. Children who are children of color, children who have less economic means or present with a less stereotypical gender presentation are more vulnerable. There's more experiences of fear. There's more aggression towards kids, more projections, depending on their circumstances. Meaning that gets attached. Kids come up with stories if you don't help them with a narrative, and they might think, well, God doesn't like me, or that they're bad, or it's their fault. So what meaning is getting attached, and what help is there for this child as they are interpreting what's happened to them? And then validation versus disbelief. If a child reveals that something happened to them and they are blamed or told that's ridiculous, or life goes on like nothing and there's no intervention, that's like another layer of violation and not feeling safe. And then another set of contextual factors is really how did caregivers respond? If a child experiences a caregiver that is calm and responsive, they're going to be able to what's called co-regulate, which is support the child's nervous system to calm, because the child can borrow some of their calm. And how much care was received right after the event? Because if you have support earlier, you calm down or get feeling safer earlier. And also, how much is the network that supports this child aware of what has happened? Because behaviors are communication, and they're often communicating the child's sense of safety. And so what might be seen as bad is really like this child is frightened. And if the parents, if the network knows, the church or the school, if people understand there's a potential for gathering together about what we're doing for interventions, and how we're understanding what we're seeing. So this is a diagram to depict the idea of what is happening in a nervous system. So this yellow line, that is a wavy line, think of that as the energy or level of arousal in the nervous system. If a child has a fairly safe experience in childhood, things happen that provide a stressor and there's support and they calm. There's a stressor and there's support and then they come back to center. And it doesn't mean perfect parenting or no stressors. It just means most of the time or enough of the time, there's enough repeated experiences to create resiliency. And so what that will look like in a child who has a more resilient nervous system is that they're playful, they're affectionate, respectful, they're listening, they're cooperative. And what the parent looks like is the parent is calm when they talk, they have gentle hands, they listen, problem solve, and they're seeing options. So that's what, like when you're in that nice window of tolerance where you can manage your level of energy in your nervous system. But in this diagram, this red jiggity jaggedy line is if there's been traumatic events. So there's triggers that happen that activate the nervous system into the stress response. You see the behaviors where we end up getting requests for service. So the child could be destructive, hitting, teasing, defiant, running around, impulsive, zoning out. And then on the other hand, they might be perfectly well behaved, but they're having somatic experiences. They have stomach aches, they can't sleep, they have headaches. And for the parent, you might see them making threats and punishing, yelling, criticizing, being impatient, hitting, tired, they can't sleep themselves, they're crying easily, and they're lethargic. And all of this is happening because instead of that nice like wave of arousal being manageable, they're either getting bumped into this high arousal called hyperarousal, which is higher energy in the nervous system, which is where you see the more outward behaviors, or they're bumped into the low zone where you see numbness, sadness, more flatness and lethargy. Or there's a lot of up and down. They can't maintain regulation because it's an overwhelming experience of activation. So what do I mean by a trauma trigger? It's a stimulus that returns the child back in time to the trauma experience. And that could be internal, like a sensation reminder, or external. And when I say sensation reminder, we take in information as humans through our senses. And so there may not be intentional recall that there is that there is something that's bringing them back to the past, but it happens. So like an example, say a child had an abusive parent and that parent wore a certain kind of deodorant that had a certain smell, and they go to school and their teacher aide who spends time around them wears the same deodorant. That child may find themselves, acting up, but there's nothing, like the teachers will say, there's nothing going on and this child is acting out. But what is happening for that child is that scent is a sensation reminder of previous very fearful experiences. And so you might get the behaviors that show that this child doesn't feel safe, and it may not make sense to you. External things may be places or anniversaries. And an example is when we have kids that have been removed from their homes at certain times of year, like a holiday, like say Halloween, where that's a long period of lots of environmental cues about Halloween. There's pumpkins, there's trick or treat, there's lots of things, there's activities at school, there's a lot of different I'm echoing a setting. Can you help? I don't know if you were hearing me.
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So those things put this kid constantly on alert because they were removed at that time, they lost a caregiver, whatever the reason was that they were removed, that's in the mix. So the stress response turns on and you get behaviors, or you get this child having an internal experience that's not a behavior that you're seeing, but they're having flashbacks, or they have nightmares at night. So memory. Memory is the capacity to bring elements of an experience from one moment in time to another. So there's the implicit kind where there's no conscious recall that I just talked about. And then there's the explicit kind, which is more autobiographical. So like I can remember that I went to the beach and I picked up shells. But with the implicit kind, it's harder because you're not aware that you're recalling something, but you are recalling it. Your body is remembering. And the thing is that our brains are like it's a pattern maker. So it's designed to help us generalize information to the future. It's that because our brain is wired to keep us safe. So for example, if there was some incident that happened where a child had lots of sirens going off, that child's brain, when they are having had scary experiences, even when they're not in a scary experience, sirens going off sets the pattern of alarm in motion for that child that something bad's going to happen because something bad did happen. So you will, there's any number of things that can be triggers, and you kind of have to be get to know a child, and you start to see patterns yourself to know what it is that might be triggering them, because they may not be able to tell you. So our brain, important to understand some things about our brain. Our brain develops from the bottom to the top. And the brainstem is the part of the brain that is first to develop. It's developed fully formed in utero. So when you're born, your brain has the capacity to have a stress response, to manage your breathing, your heart rate. And it's designed to help you survive. It's all about survival with the brain. And so it's about being able to detect threat so that you can procreate and go to another generation, right? So that's part of the pattern making thing. Like if ancestors didn't realize quick that a saber-toothed tiger was dangerous and know that pattern, that, oh, that growling noise means I need to book it, we wouldn't be here, right? So it's like there's an advantageousness to the patterns, but it can become problematic, which we'll talk about. The limbic system is a part of the brain that regulates emotions. And then the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's involved with thinking, reasoning. So it's all about like kind of being the CEO of the brain. How our wiring happens depends on what I say is like how the love happens. Because although the brainstem's ready to go when we're born, the prefrontal cortex takes 25, 26 years to be fully formed. You know, that we have a long period of dependency as humans. So how emotions are regulated has a lot to do with whether we will end up being able to be good thinkers and reasoners and planners, assuming typical neurotypical development. I mean, actually, even if you don't have neurotypical development, it still matters how you're cared for and how you're supported with your feelings. So neurons that fire together, wire together. And so that's for good and for ill. We are experience dependent beings. We're born with ready to go for stress response and breathing, but how our brains then develop has to do with what has happened. So this diagram is a PET scan of two brains. On your left is a healthy brain, and on your right is the brain of a person that has been abused. And in this case, this child was a Romanian orphan who was institutionalized pretty much soon after birth. So I want to open this up to everyone to think about 3 differences that you notice in the two brains. And you can either put it in the chat or on mute to say somebody to let us know, what do you see? What's different between the brain on the left and the brain on the right? 3 things. I can't see the chat. Joanne, is there anything in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. So we got less brain activity, less color, it's more red on the healthy side, more empty space and less brain activity on the abused brain, less active, higher activity on the left, less activity in the frontal part.
Okay, excellent. You guys are good observers. That is absolutely right. So the brain on the left, you see, this is the prefrontal cortex, super activated. Brainstem, not as activated, and there's a lot of wiring connecting the back to the front. Brain on the right, brainstem, very activated. Frontal cortex, not too much activity. And the temporal lobes have a lot of gaps. So the temporal lobes have a lot to do also with our emotions, because it's how we process faces, how we manage emotions. These are some of the things the temporal lobe does. So this child who did not get appropriate care has wiring of being more afraid, because that's the brainstem part. They probably will have difficulties with thinking and learning and processing information. And they definitely will have relational difficulties because how you read faces has a lot to do. A lot of our relatedness is nonverbal. So reading faces, processing emotions, this child would have a lot more difficulty being in functioning, period, and being in relationship. Now, this is an extreme case, right? This is, we're not typically having someone that's in an institution from birth, not getting appropriate care in the families that we work with. But I wanted to show it to demonstrate just how it literally can happen, that how we care for our children impacts how their brains develop. That being said, the brain is not isolated. It functions in connection with the environment, so our relatedness, but all the other things, our nurture, our food, our water, our sense of safety. And so neuroplasticity is about our hope. So neuroplasticity isn't just about our brain changing. It's about our whole system because it's all connected. We've got all this wiring happening between the brain and other body parts and organs that they're sending messages to each other. So as we look at healing, safety is key. Like I said in the beginning, one of the key bio things, the messages from today is safety is treatment. Because when you feel safer, your body's not activating and you feel in relationship usually. And children need us to support them for them to heal.
We have a question in the chat that says, how do we access this type of image for ourselves and children?
I actually got this image from another presentation that I went to. So I can send out my slides when we're done, if you'd like it.
Yeah, I believe the question was more so, how can we accomplish that type of brain image for ourselves and our children?
I mean, how to get there?
Yes.
That's what we're going to be covering for the rest of
Okay.
the presentation. Okay. All right. So our target is relational safety. Like how we get there is about how we are in relationship, because safety is treatment. Behavior in young children is communicating their felt sense of safety usually, and how caregivers are responding will impact whether they feel safer or not. So how does a child tell if they're safe? The nervous system's capacity to evaluate risk is done through a term called neuroception. And remember the saber-toothed tiger thing I mentioned before? We are designed and wired to do things very quickly to assess for safety. And that's not happening consciously. That's happening through various cues. It's inside the body, like, do we feel pain? Are we experiencing hunger? Is our heart rate racing? Outside in the environment, is there something big and scary and loud? And then between people, our tone of voice, the quality of gestures, the apparent feelings of the other person. So this is all happening automatically. This is something that our brain and body are doing without us thinking about it. It's happening super fast. It's really different though than perception, where we are thinking about things. So for children, they, and all of us really, we have both things happening. Our brains are wired for survival. So we have this drive to be safe and manage threat. And then we have the desire to connect. We have the desire to be in relationship. Humans are social beings. So what will help a child to feel safe? The quality of our tone of voice, our gestures, our eye gaze, and our proximity. Because that we're biologically wired to read each other, and it happens super fast. And so especially tone of voice, because like if someone sounds angry, it changes. Like even if they say something that's nice, it doesn't feel it because the tone doesn't match the message. So the quality of our tone of voice, what kind of gestures are we doing? Do we incite fear or connection? What's happening with our eyes? And how close are we? Excuse me. So Bruce Perry, he's a child trauma researcher. He talks about the importance of the 3 R's to help children. So first, that regulation is calming stress responses and relating as we do that to get to reasoning. And often what happens is we want to reason about appropriate behavior because we're worried about their conduct, but they can't hear it because they're biologically not in that window of tolerance. And how do we get there? It's through our relatedness, but also it might be through sensory interventions to help the body calm. And I'll be talking about that in some of my case examples.
And we have another question in the chat.
Sure.
It says, is it possible if the tone is soft and this person has violated them, and if this person has also violated them and their trust with those who speak softly?
Definitely. And that's some of the really mixed up, mucky stuff that happens for people if they have had someone give those mixed signals. It gets confusing. Yes. So it's not a definite that is just that you always have to be soft. It does depend on all the other context. So traumatized children are affected by faulty neuroception. So that, remember, neuroception is how we assess for safety. So remember how I was saying earlier, the brain is a pattern maker? Well, if you have more wiring from the brainstem because you didn't have enough support when you were younger, you are more likely to perceive threat, even if there isn't threat. And so when children feel a sense of safety, they do things that are socially engaged. They play nice. They do what you want them to do. They cooperate, they share, they take perspective, they have empathy for their peers. But if they feel a sense of danger, you see more fight, flight, freeze. And so kids are going to need messages of nurture and safety and relationship in order to feel safe. And unfortunately, there's a feedback loop that's happening where a normal cue, like for example, say a child has had multiple scary experiences with people who were supposed to take care of them and didn't. And they're in school and a new person is coming to do an observation. That's a normal thing to have a child, have people come into a classroom, but this is not feeling normal to a child. They go into fight, flight, freeze. And the teacher is saying, okay, now we're going to sit here and do circle time or whatever. But the child isn't hearing that because they're back in time with that trauma trigger of, okay, something's going to happen bad here. And they become more activated and you get more challenging behaviors. Sometimes it's externalized and other times they're shut down depending on that child's nervous system. So what do we do? I think first it's important to think about what might be happening for this child. What do you know about their context? What's the child's age? Where are they at developmentally? What's the state of their nervous system and what might they need to get that regulate so you can get to reason? And often what kids are doing is they're having a problem behavior that is their solution to create safety because that's the skill set they have at this point. And that's part of why we need intervention.
We have another question in the chat that says, are there more traumatized children now after the challenging times? Are we seeing more challenging reactive cases with children now?
Well, I'm going to make a guess on that because I don't have statistics to back up what I'm saying. But I think after having the pandemic, there probably was a lot more stress that happened in families because people were all the various things. They're either all home together, parents had to become a teacher, or they lose jobs and they're worried about housing. I mean, all these different stressors that were happening that would make regulation harder for a caregiver. So I would guesstimate yes, but I don't have statistics to back up what I'm saying. range of stress. So stress sometimes gets a bad rap where we think we just don't want stress. We always want to be calm. But the truth is humans need stress to grow and develop. You do have to take steps and you do have to try and learn to ride that bike or have a different teacher. Or there's developmentally normal things that are challenging and it's stressful, but it's part of growing and being a human. So those are like positive range of stress things where there's just brief increases in heart rate. There's mild elevations in stress hormones. Tolerable stress is more serious. It's more intense, like there might be a car accident or maybe there might be a death in the family, but there are people to provide support. So you have supportive relationships that can bring you back into a window of tolerance. But toxic stress is prolonged. There's a prolonged activation of the stress response, and sometimes there isn't protective relationships. And it doesn't mean the child doesn't have relationships, but they're not getting supported in a way that brings them into regulation. Let's leave it at that. So ACEs stands for adverse childhood experiences, and these tend to be more toxic stress, things that are ongoing. So an ACE we're defining as a potentially traumatic event that occurred in childhood between birth and 17 years. And these can be either direct experiences, such as abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, or it's contextual, the environmental context of the child's home life that leaves them not feeling safe or stable or feeling a sense of bonding. And that could be a parent using substances or having mental health problems, inability to be with their parent because the parent is either they're removed from the home or the parent might be incarcerated. So these are different ways where the context for this child does not feel safe and stable. So the original ACE study came about because a doctor at Kaiser in San Diego, Dr. Vincent Felitti, was running an obesity clinic, and he saw an interesting trend where some of the most successful people at losing weight would drop out of the program. So he wanted to understand this dynamic, and he did some interviews with these people and found that a consistent theme was that they all had sexual abuse histories, and they had used their weight as a way to protect themselves. And so he thought that this should be studied more, like how bodies respond to stress from childhood. So he had presented this information at a conference, and Robert Amda from the Center for Disease Control learned of the information and partnered with Felitti to do a big study. And they took like 17,000 members from Kaiser and San Diego, and they did a lot of physical tests about their health and did surveys about their childhood trauma. And the sample was mostly white people. They were working, they had insurance, and they asked about these original 10 ACEs. So this is where they had the abuse option, the neglect, and then what they called household dysfunction. And what they found is that most of the people had at least one ACE, and if they had one, they were more likely to have two. And what was startling is that these experiences in childhood were impacting the health of people in their 50s, because the average age of the person in the study was 57. So that opened up a whole nother thinking about, well, what is happening in childhood and what's happening in the body. So since then, there have been other things that have been listed as adverse childhood experiences, but they haven't had the magnitude of research of that original study, but have been involved in research. So this is some of the examples. So racism, being war or terrorism affected, a natural or man-made disaster, which now COVID is actually considered one of these, witnessing school or community violence, sexual exploitation, and medical trauma. So these are some examples of adverse childhood experiences. So we're going to be focusing a little bit more on how racism plays a part historically and currently in ACEs in the upcoming slides. So epigenetics is the study of how behaviors and environment can affect, activate, or silence gene expression. So why does this matter? Because if the genes that manage the stress response get silenced, then you have a child who has a stress response that's really wonky. And that sets up a trajectory for a future where they are more likely to have health problems, inflammatory hormones, hyperarousal, making it harder to distinguish, as I had mentioned earlier, between real and perceived stress. So you have the illness issue, and then you have the relational issue. So one thing that has become clear over time is that there is a dose-response relationship. As the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for negative outcomes. So why is that? Well, if we're saying that toxic stress is about prolonged and frequent stress without enough support, we're looking at biologically the heart rate being increased, increases in blood pressure, breathing and muscle tension, which then promotes stress hormones being released and the immune system becoming depressed and opening the gateway for more health problems. And potential exists also for more mental illness and substance use and differences in ability to learn. That being said, I want to say that ACE's number isn't destiny because other factors influence a child and their nervous system, and each individual nervous system is different. And I think of like when sometimes I get kids on my caseload and I get an intake and I see like 7 ACEs. I'm like, oh my God, this child, and they're 4. But then I meet the child. And like this one little girl pops into my head, she was sparkly. She had a lot of charisma, and she was very likable and very curious and creative. So she had personality-wise strengths that would make her engaging, and she had talent. She was creative. And so where I'm going with this is that all of those factors mitigate what would happen for her in her relationships and how she would feel about herself. So it's not destiny that if you have a lot of ACEs, that your life will be terrible. There's all kinds of mitigating factors. It's just that there's a correlation, that there's an increased risk because of biology. Okay, so historical trauma and ACEs in context. So all of these ACEs that we've talked about all tend towards, all the ones that were in the original study, were all things about the microcosm of the nuclear family, the things that are happening in your home. But what wasn't being taken into account at the time, because hindsight's always 2020, like what wasn't being taken into account is when we say environment, it's not just the environment of your home, it's the environment in our society. And what is the historical society history and what has happened for people that are impacting health today. So if we start over here, and this is from the work of Chandra Ghosh-Ippen and Marquita Mays. So if you take historical trauma in the United States, we have many examples of forced sacrifice of people of color. Genocide from Native Americans in the beginning of when white Europeans came here, the removal of property, the entire process of colonizing any group that wasn't white, slavery for many generations, and forced family separations. These are all hugely traumatic events in the history of the United States. And we move to today, where from these dynamics and state instituted plans of managing people, of organizing people and hierarchies, we have some of the current systemic oppression. We have more police violence that's happening in communities of color, it's mostly seems to be, in my observations from reading the news, more targeted towards African-American men. There's more mass incarceration of people of color, mostly African-American. Inequities in preschool suspension, in child welfare, in pay, in access to housing and segregation. And there's lots of different subsets of problems that come from this. If we're going to say that a parent is in jail as an ACE, but we're having state-sanctioned police dehumanizing people of color, and if we have preschool suspension where children aren't allowed to stay in school at a very young age, we know that if you go to preschool or you go to school, you're more likely to stay in school. You're more likely to graduate from school, more likely to make a better income. And if you have a better income, you live in a neighborhood that is potentially safer. And so it's like a domino effect. And inequities in child welfare, often children that stay and get removed or stay in the child welfare system longer are children of color. And the thing about separation, well, they're being separated from their parents. And if you have a mom who is experiencing domestic violence, the system says you're not keeping your child safe, but how is this mom supposed to get housing and leave if she's not able to make more money? So if she's not getting good pay. And just in terms of the history of segregation in the US and how housing was laid out, how highways were laid out, the length of commutes, the cost of commutes, how many people have to live together, which increases the likelihood of conflicts and illness transmission. There's a lot of government sanctioned and environmental contexts that impact what is happening in a family and within options for people who may struggle and need more support in order to stabilize that generation for the next generation. I'd like to pause this now to do a mindfulness activity. We're going to do a body scan. And because I know we've covered some very heavy things. I want to credit the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, whose work I'm drawing upon to offer you this body scan. And start us out with a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh. It's called For Warmth. I hold my face between my hands. No, I am not crying. I hold my face in my two hands to keep the loneliness warm. Two hands protecting, two hands nourishing, two hands preventing my soul from leaving me in anger. Let's continue to turn our attention inward. I invite you to bring your body into a relaxed and aligned posture. I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable to do that, and if not, place your gaze somewhere that is not distracting. And for right now, we're just going to let our body settle. Just notice where you might be experiencing pain or discomfort in your body, where there's constriction, where there's relaxation maybe, or expansiveness. I invite you to offer yourself some soothing gesture. This could be placing a hand on your heart, hand on your belly, holding your hands, whatever you'd like, but something where you are being kind to yourself and you're offering yourself affectionate support. And you can choose to keep your hands there for the rest of this meditation or let them rest elsewhere. So let's begin the scan with our head and our face. Just notice if the muscles around your jaw and your eyes are holding any energy or tension. If yes, just invite those muscles to relax. Just offer yourself affection to soften and soothe this area. Follow your attention to your neck. If you feel tense, just notice the tension and gently let your breath rise and fall in your body. The body just breathes itself. Just let more space open up between your muscle fibers. Now let's continue to our shoulders. What do you feel there? Just send warm compassion to your shoulders and offer tender care to the stress that you may be carrying on your shoulders. And take a nice deep breath right now. I invite you to shift your focus to your stomach area. We often hold a lot of tension there. Just give your belly permission to relax. Just offering yourself a kind presence as you breathe. And let's follow our attention to our pelvic area. We sit a lot and our hips hold a lot of tension. Just notice what feelings are in your pelvic bowl. Just let yourself breathe some warm, kind affection to this area of the body. Let's follow our attention to our thighs. Is there any tension there? Invite your muscles just to relax. And as we end the body scan, how are your feet doing? Just take a deep breath in and send warm affection to your feet. And we're going to close this body scan with a few deep, comforting breaths. And I invite you to offer yourself greater soothing by doing longer exhales. I'll do the counting for us. Inhale and exhale. That's one. Inhale and exhale. Two. And last one. Inhale and exhale. When you're ready, you can gently open your eyes and release this practice. So now we're going to turn our attention to babies. And how do we see trauma in babies? Bring back to your mind that window of tolerance diagram about hyper and hypoarousal and window of tolerance being where you're just right. In babies, hyperarousal looks like fussiness, difficulty soothing, being very easily startled, arching the back, difficulty settling, difficulties with sleeping and eating, and a rigid, stiff muscle tone. Hypoarousal is shut down, looking vacant. They may sleep excessively, limited movement, being kind of floppy, having an averted gaze, less responsive to interaction, and maybe they don't signal the caregiver because they're not crying too much. So how are babies affected by interparental conflict? Graham, Fisher, and Pfeiffer did a study with 6 to 12-month-old sleeping babies. And they wanted to see, are babies affected by voices while they're asleep? Some of the babies were from homes where there was domestic violence, and others weren't. And they were put to sleep at their normal bedtimes. And there was a male voice that said nonsense sentences, and they did it in different tones: neutral, happy, angry and very angry while in an fMRI machine. And an fMRI machine basically takes pictures of the brain in the moment, so you can see what's happening. And what the fMRI studies show is that all babies process emotional speech during sleep, and babies from homes with higher conflict were more sensitive to the very angry speech. Because I often hear, oh, they were asleep, they couldn't hear anything, but babies hear in their sleep, and so they are affected. So now I want to show a still face video, and if the forces are with me with technology, this is going to work. So I'm going to stop share and share my screen. This. I'm sorry. Share. Share screen. Are you seeing a baby?
Yes, we see a video on YouTube.
Okay, and I want to make sure you have sound. So let me stop share and then make sure I reshare it with sound. Hang on.
Okay.
Share sound. Okay. This is a still face experiment in which you're going to see a mother be in relationship with her baby and then be asked to turn away. And we're going to watch what happens between the mother and the baby. And then I'm going to ask you what insights you got from the video. It's about 2.5 minute long video.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Good nights give unbeatable protection against bed.
So what did you feel like you got out of that video? about how parents impact babies.
We have some comments in the chat that say an eye-opening video, good stuff. Interesting video, how observant infants can be to our reactions and behaviors. Babies also need positive attention from parents.
Yes, so I'm really glad that you see that too, because I thought it was remarkable. That was 2 minutes. You know, that was like 2 minutes of time. And think of how much time you have when you have a child in your care, and how it impacted a baby. And in that case, that baby and mom had a pretty good relationship. You know, like you could see that they had a nice, you know, regulated experience, but the child didn't feel safe anymore when the mother had a blank face and wasn't engaged with her. And so it's not that you have to always be perfectly engaged. That's not the point. Everybody has to live and manage and do chores and whatnot. It's you know, that's not the goal. Isn't constant engagement, but that attunement and that repairing of rupture does matter. And I know this was a mother, but it's actually the exact same thing for fathers, mothers and fathers, and it doesn't matter race either. It's human, that we need connection and responsiveness and repairs. And that a lot happens non-verbally, because that baby doesn't have language yet, but a lot of communicating happened between the mother and the baby. Is there anything else before I move to the next thing?
Yes, we
Roxanne.
Oh, go
It's
ahead.
okay to, I was just gonna say it's Emily from First Five. I just am amazed every time I see that video, because I've watched it a few times, how the mom manages to keep her face like that. Like, I mean, it's amazing to me. Like, for some reason, that always strikes me too. Is like, I feel like if I were the mom, that would be so hard to deny that too. Just strikes me.
Yes, I always feel pained about that part as well. How hard it is especially if you're very connected, to know that baby's suffering a little bit, but it was at least short.
And we have some more comments on how quickly the response was from the infant.
Yes, babies, their little circles of need are faster than when kids are older, because babies are dependent, right? So they need you to co-regulate more, because they don't have a well-developed brain and faculties. So that's why those interactions really matter, that back and forth.
Yeah, and I have a question too. When it comes to the repair you're talking about, will you be speaking more on that?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to bring us back. All right, so how do we help fussy babies? We try and notice their cues and responses and see what the baby's cues tell you. And you have to make a guess, right? Because they don't have language. But comforting things, you try cuddling and warmth, and some babies don't want cuddling, you know, so you have to figure out as you go, changing positions, rocking, holding, dancing, balancing between resting and stimulating the baby. I know when my son was little, I felt like I knocked my knees out sitting on a bouncy ball, bouncing him, right? So like, it's balancing that. Soothing sensory input. Sometimes having a radio on static or a white noise machine can make a child feel calmer. Kind of like when you have a fan on. Like, I like to sleep with the fan on. And for fussy babies, we watch for cues that the baby is overwhelmed, that they may need less stimulation. They may need a quieter environment, or less movement, more movement. And even if the baby's crying and the caregiver is responding and what you're doing is not working, what does your baby learn about safety? That you stay with it. They learn that you're going to be there. They learn that they don't have to be perfect. You know, they learn that they can trust. And again, your tone and proximity matters. So now we're going to switch our attention to young children, and the cases that I'm going to present are all mine. And I'm going to first talk about how you see trauma in fight, flight, freeze, because we've talked about the stress response. And so I'll go over that and the cases, and then things that you can do, like books and calm down kids. So how do you know children are traumatized? Often their play tells us. They repeat what's distressing over and over. You have changes in how they function. They may stop sleeping. They may stop using the potty when they already were potty trained. Whatever activity level they were at, it reverses. You might see them becoming more hyper or more lethargic. And sometimes there's fears or avoidance behaviors that weren't there before, like that same sparkly girl, she all of a sudden would be afraid to go to the bathroom because she was certain that there was a spider in there. First, she was perfectly fine before. They might have more intensity in their emotions, more anger and fear responses, more impulsiveness, or maybe they're scattered more. And sometimes you get somatic complaints that don't have a medical reason. And in addition to the potty training going off, you might hear kids start talking like a baby, and you're like, what's going on? Because they were perfectly capable of talking just fine for the age group before. Or their milestones might start to be delayed when they were doing fine before. They don't have the same emotional energy to keep on going with development because they're stepped back by having to process psychologically and or biologically their trauma. So what's the impact of exposure to trauma in relationships? If you're repeatedly afraid, you get that brain wiring, that right activation in the brainstem from that picture, and you don't have trust. You don't have a sense of safety and connectedness. So we were talking earlier about the biological things that happen intergenerationally and contextually in the environment. Now we're going to hone it into what's happening in relationships where trauma repeats, especially violence repeats in families. So these are the steps. The parent has past experiences of violence. They create a working model of this is how I am in relationships. Then this creates expectations of how a child will be in relationship with them. The parent only attunes to those expectations, and the child internalizes how to behave and behaves that way. So I'm going to give you an example of this. So I'm going to call this child Sammy. Sammy was 5 years old, and she was on the autism spectrum. And both of her parents had histories of domestic violence, but not with each other. And they both had histories of intensive substance abuse. When I met them, they were both clean and they'd been married for a while. And this was, they had never done any violent behavior, physical violence with each other in front of Sammy, but they did argue a lot. Sammy was in 2 school settings and an aftercare. But so she was out of the home a good 40 hours a week between school and aftercare or before school care. In every one of those settings, 0 aggression. No aggression all day long for a whole week. Go home, she's aggressive to her parents and she's aggressive to her siblings. So what was going on there? I'll tell you. In these parents' case, they were really like, I feel hero and heroine. These are people who made good from all kinds of early difficulty. They got themselves off of drugs. They had stable job, housing, weren't having physical violence, but the patterns were still there. So in mom's case, she had a history of being physically abused. So what this child would do, this child would hit her and mom would do nothing. So this is the day I go to this was a home-based case. I go to their house and this kid was jumping on the bed and I was talking to her parents, and the dad was on a beanbag and I was standing there talking to mom, and she was playing with her teenage sister. And she got mad that I was still talking to mom and I hadn't started like playing with them. And she comes over and she slams mom on the front of her chest really, really hard. And I was so taken aback that she had done that. And so mom's response to that was nothing. Dad continued to talk to me about the weekend. And I'm like, are you kidding me? You're not going to say anything? Is this okay with you? And they're like, oh, she just plays rough. You know, she's got special needs. And I'm like, well, she's in school all day and she's at her aftercare and all of that, and she's not playing rough. So like, you actually need to intervene. And what I would notice is the reverse would happen with dad. She would never hit dad, but she would say abusive things to dad, just like mom would do. So dad had his own history of violence, and he had experiences where he had a lot of verbal abuse. So in both cases, each parent had vulnerability for a different kind of abuse. Like in the mom's case, she was vulnerable about physical abuse. And in the dad's case, he was vulnerable about verbal abuse. So the child was fascinating to me because she never did anything verbally abusive to her mother because her mother would not tolerate it. She would set a limit, but her mother wouldn't set limits about the physical things. The father would never tolerate physical things. He would stop her right away, but he would tolerate her telling him terrible things. So the parents had past experiences. It created a model of how to be in relationships, expectations about what was okay for this child to do. They would only respond, the mother, to the verbal things that the child would say, not the physical, the father to the physical and not the verbal. So the child learned this is how to be in intimate relationships. And she behaved this way. So I said to the parents, you know, what do you wish for? What do you want for your daughter? Because right now it's not happening in the school setting and in other relationships, but it will if this doesn't shift. And it's not okay that she's doing this to you. So here are people who are far away from active violence, but it's still impacting that next generation. And so we had to do work where we had to have an agreement where if mom was triggered, the dad would step in and set the limit with this child about how he was treating the mother, because it took her a minute to re-regulate, right? And she was not like a weeping willow. Like, she was a woman of agency. She was like a manager in her job, you know, like in the world, she had took up space, right? But in these situations of her body having something happen, freeze. So they had to partner and they had to stop being mean to each other. I'm like, what do you want for your child, right? So we worked for a year and it did shift. Their marriage got better because there was less meanness, but the child stopped doing the things she was doing with each of the parents. So that was a shift in intergenerational trauma for that family. So the stress response, how does it look? The easiest one for us to see is fight. Being argumentative, kicking, hitting, destroying property, screaming, shouting, swearing. That one's easy to see. How does that child's body feel then? They are tense in their body. They're over alert. They're not feeling safe. Maybe they even have nauseousness because blood's going to the extremities, and they might be faint or dizzy. So how do you help? You want to do less words, because if you're that activated, they're not going to hear you in the way you want them to hear you. You have to use less words, and you want to stay close if you can, because you don't want them to destroy property. And it's very natural to want to stop that, but like how you stop it matters. So giving some messages of safety and that you're going to keep them safe and you want them to be okay, and having spaces and items that help with calming if you know this is this child's pattern. Having things like bubbles and pinwheels, these are ways to help breathing happen, because you ask a kid to breathe, they look at you like, what's wrong with you? But if you pop a pinwheel in front of them or bubbles, they're more likely to do the breathing. And sometimes kids are very responsive to sensory inputs, right? Like weighted blankets or TheraBands where they can pull because they're frustrated, or Play-Doh where they can squeeze, or balls they can throw because that's okay to throw the ball, but not the chair. Physical activity can help bring down the level of regulation of arousal in the nervous system. So my most extreme experience of dealing with the fight response was with Roy. Roy was also 5, and he lived with his grandmother, who was his guardian. And he witnessed and was physically harmed by domestic violence, and neither parent was in his life. He was being raised by his grandmother. And his big trigger was abandonment, which makes sense, right? Because we're looking for safety in relationships, and he lost both parents, and he watched them hurt each other and hurt him. So what would happen is we were at the office in a session, and when it would be giving him a time warning about how much time we had left, sometimes he would just absolutely unravel, and he would try to harm me. And he was big and strong. He would throw chairs. He would try and kick me. He would punch and scream loudly. Sometimes. He wasn't always this triggered, but this was a big trigger. So what did we do? Because this wasn't doing anything of use, right? So we decided that we would go outside. We would work with his strengths. He was an excellent athlete. He was good at throwing, kicking, you name it. He could throw a football, frisbee, kick a soccer ball. He was good at it. And I'm a terrible athlete. So it was a perfect match, because instead of trying to harm me, he could throw that ball to me really fast and I wouldn't be able to catch it. And he would have to educate me on how to do this thing right? So like that going back and forth provided reciprocity, which is basically that you signal, I signal, so that I know that I am safe with you and you are here with me. And was using his physical strengths and helping him de-escalate. And people at work were like, "You're getting paid for this, to playing ball outside?" But like there was a lot going on in that playing ball outside, right? He had varying states of regulation. So sometimes, even after all of that, I'm sorry, I need to jinx it. Even after all of that, where he's calmer, we get to the car, I turn my head just a little bit to say, okay, I'm gonna go. Up his leg would go to kick me again. And so we had to be very mindful. And she was like the best grandma I've ever worked with. She was so good about finding ways to give him outlets. And in time, we ended up going back into the office, right? And what we would do is, as a session was ending, because when he wasn't so triggered, he had this great creative mind. He would be going on and on about all these various characters and his play and stuff. But when triggered, I had to navigate. And then he would feel guilty because he would feel like I would never like him again. And I could never come back next week, because he would be conscious of what he was doing, but could not stop himself. His survival response for fight was so strong, which makes tons of sense to me, because he was in a car seat when his parents would be doing all of their conflict. So, like his wanting to fight is to me, like that he would be conformed that way made lots of sense. So when she would drive off, she'd be halfway to Pittsburgh. She would call me so I could let him know that I still liked him and that I know that he's trying his best and we are working on things. So what I want to say is, like, if he didn't have intervention, what kind of relationships do you think he would have in adulthood? I mean, you have some idea. If he was doing this at 5, what would be happening when he was in his 20s? So it's so important that we work on building safety for kids, and how we do it is different for each kid. But seeing where they are in the stress response, that's one way. And then who you're working with. In this case, grandma was really in it to win it. She was really engaged. So we're going to pause for a second, and I want you to think about the things we've talked about. And imagine that there's a 5-year-old child who's with his mom and siblings in a waiting room for like We can make it 30 minutes or less. They're waiting to meet someone to talk about this family violence episode that happened the day before. The 5-year-old is yelling loudly and hitting his sister and refusing to share and screaming no to everything his mother says. How would you think about his behavior from a trauma-informed perspective? And what would you do to help him? Anybody? What do you think's happening? Which stress response is he on?
In the chat, we have a comment, help to create a safe environment. Another comment says, take him outside to walk around.
So that, both things are true. You want to take him outside to walk around so that he can get a breather, right? Like that physical movement helps him to calm, probably orienting and seeing that he's safe, that nothing bad's happening. Because remember, he's in a waiting room of someplace he don't know, right? So like somewhere where he can see, okay, there's the trees, there's people, I'm okay. So he can orient to safety. That's important.
There's another comment that says, I would use words to express how he is feeling.
Yes. And what kind of words?
Such as, I am not feeling happy.
Yes, yes. You're not feeling happy. So reflecting the feeling state and reflecting what's happening with his body. Your voice has gotten very loud and you're moving really fast. And I know that you're not feeling good right now. So like some empathic reflecting about what he's experiencing and what his body is doing. And ideally, some things that you can do to help him calm his body. Because the relatedness is one piece, but it's also what else can we do?
There's another comment that says, talk to him down to his level and engage with him one-on-one with simple words. Another comment says, using the 3 R's, reason, regulate, relate, and regulate.
Right. So a couple of things that came up that were new and that were just said, getting down to his level is kind of important because if you're an adult, you look like a giant, right? So if it's safe, right, to get down so you can be more on their level and they can meet you in that way and they can pick up. And ideally, step 1 is actually what your calm level is. And then the 3 R's, the regulate before, the reason, regulate, all of that. That is some of the sensory stuff. So is it the walking, the pinwheels, the Play-Doh, the bubbles, whatever it is that you can do to help decrease that activation in the nervous system to try and get him more into a window and help him have cues of safety from how you're interacting, your gestures, your tone of voice, your proximity, your willingness to be with him in distress. Is there anything else? Yes,
Yeah,
being a guess.
Mhm.
And that might work if he's able to reason. But he might not be at that place yet. He might need more help to get to where he can do that reasoning. Okay, I'm gonna return to the. So what about flight? Flight's another one that can be somewhat easy to see because kids are running away. But it can be flight in other ways. They could be covering their face and hands. They might be pulling their jacket over their head, avoiding activities, doing baby talk, hiding under tables, daydreaming. And what is their body feeling like? They're ready for action. That's why they want to run. They might be jumpy and tense, and their heart might be going super fast, and their breathing might be faster. And they might be nauseous again because you're going to the extremities for action. And there's a lot of arousal in the nervous system. So how do you help them to feel safe? You definitely have to stop them from running into the street or the parking lot if it's that level of unsafe. And so you have to physically grab them to not let that happen if it's on that level. If you can make things predictable, having something be easy and simple to do. And if they really need that exertion, you need to do physical activity. Maybe those small exercise trampolines, if you have that, bouncing on an exercise ball, sometimes doing something really like a hard chewing gum, or a space where they can hide, under pillows or one of those little pop-up tents or something like that. If you know that this child tends to have these things. So this is the most extreme experience I've ever had with the flight response. Also 5-year-old, I will call him William. This is a family where I work with all 3 generations. William was not involved with CFS. That was also the same for Roy. I work with both sets of grandparents, but there was no CFS involvement. The grandparents just kind of took over. So it was kinship care without CFS. In this case, mom had a significant substance use history as well as domestic violence. He had that experience in utero and for the first year of life. And his mother did not have a good relationship with her parents. And he was really a huge flight risk. He would try and run away, like run out the door at school and stuff. So the grandparents were initially doing the services with me, and then mother got clean and wanted to reunify with her son. Now, in his case, not only was the general, neglect that comes from substance use, she used to do, and what she was trying to do to keep him safe actually was very hard for him. She would leave him in a crib and put a piece of board over it and take off, figuring that he would be safe if he was in this crib, and leave the air conditioning on, and then he would be cold and then he couldn't get out, right? So what is his body determined as his way of survival is flight, right? Because he couldn't get out. And so the first session, and I work 410s, so I had them late in the day. And after having had Roy's case, I'm like, there's no way I'm doing them while my colleagues are there. If he does anything, I didn't know what would happen. Like if he's throwing chairs, doing all this stuff, I don't want to have to deal with everybody else. So I put them at the end of the day. So I'm the only person in the building. It's dark. They come in the door and mom says, I need to use the bathroom. And so I turn my head to tell her it's down the hall. It was a good distance away from the front door. He bolts out of the building and takes off. And he's another big kid. And I'm like, oh my God, right? So we both take off. I don't really know her. I haven't worked with him yet. So it was my first time meeting him. So he takes off and we're both spreading out. And where our office was at the time was pretty near where there's a 680 ramp. So I'm like, oh my God, he's gonna come to therapy to die, right? So like he takes off going down the road. Mom goes one way, I go the other, because we don't know where he went. He was so fast and it was dark. She finds him and brings him back. And you know what he says? She's like, where did you go? And he goes, I went to see the cat. I'm like, the cat? And he's like, yes, the cat. So there's this group of cats that are on the road there near Waterworld, that Waterworld Parkway there. There's like a group of cats that live there. And he's like, he didn't have his mommy. So I wanted to go help him. So here's the trauma in the play, right? And here's his mom, bless her, that she's trying to do the right thing and reunify with his child. And thankfully, she was someone who was very creative. So we made a plan, and actually many people in the agency got involved because that was so frightening. I got the OT to loan me one of those bouncy, those little trampolines, so he could, if he wants to run, he can run in place in the playroom. And I got hard chewing gum so that he could try and calm his nervous system. And a big exercise ball. I took everything out of the playroom because he was clearly a very active person and we weren't going to be anywhere near doing pretend play anyways. So, and I didn't know what mom's play capacity was. And thankfully she was creative. So she wrote a story about a kitty cat who had lost his mommy, who found her again. And grandpa loaned us a fish tackle box so he could lock. So she could put the picture of a cat and the story in a box, and he could carry that with him. So the cat's okay, but we aren't gonna have to take care of the cat. The cat's okay, and you're gonna come into the playroom. And I used to have to put like little door tags on all the doors that had red for no, not through that door we run. Green is the bathroom or the playroom. That's the only doors you can go in. I mean, this was like a big event every time he came to sessions. He never ran out of the building again. And we had a deal that he could chew gum and bounce on the trampoline, but not at the same time. And he and mom would do play. Now, over time, you know, like they did a lot of bouncing on the ball and rolling on the ball, all kinds of stuff. Over time, we got to more of the nitty gritty, and he would try and do things to aggravate his mother. He would crash cars, and she had a trauma history, so loud noises would trigger her. And then she would say, don't do it, and he would keep doing it. So I had to come up with something. So what I ended up doing is starting collecting egg cartons, because that's something you could crash that didn't make noise. So then I had to be asking everybody for their freaking egg cartons so he could jump on the egg cartons, crash the egg cartons, because I wanted to give him the outlet he wanted in a way that would work for this mother. And then over time, he got to the dialogue, and he's like, you left me. And like he could be angry, and, you know, you put me under a board, you know, like he would explain to her why she was so angry. And she's like, I'm sorry, I really wasn't in my best mind at the time. And I did what I could do to keep you safe, or what I thought I was doing that would keep you safe. So over time, things settled more with them and with their parents, with her parents, because I kept meeting with them because they were very harsh and punitive to her as well. So it was an intergenerational trauma and intergenerational therapy, but it did get better. So the last of the stress response things we're going to talk about is freeze. And that's harder to see. But it's basically like when they're zoning out and daydreaming or staring into space, the child might be lethargic and unresponsive to questions or commands. And what does it feel like for them? It feels like a fog. Everything's like a dream. And what do? You know, there's not a whole lot you can do if someone's spaced out. You just have to be near. And when they return, help them to feel safe and oriented again. And in the case of William, both of the boys I mentioned, William and Roy, would space out. In William's case, his mom would tap in his shoe and just say, hey, we're right here. We're right here, very gently. And we're going to do this next. And he would come back to it. But there's, it can be a little disorienting. And so sensory comforts can help sometimes. Pushing your hands down under your seat and lifting yourself off the chair. These are things you can do, but you can't do much if they've spaced out. It's kind of like when they come back. That one I already said. So a message I want to give today is to look beyond what children's behaviors are, because they're doing whatever they are doing to attempt to feel safe. And a lot of children don't have control over their lives. And they don't have control a lot of times of the things that scare them. And they need support to feel safe. Safety is treatment, and how you're interacting with them. Sometimes it's really trial and error, but it's also how you regulate yourself, and that you're compassionate with yourself, because it may not be that you had the greatest experiences of caregiver regulation either. So key strategies: being physically close is often helpful, but not always. Some kids don't like it, but often kids do. Your tone of voice, gentle, and we mentioned earlier that could possibly be triggering based on what has happened to the child. So you do have to think about the context of who you've got. I'm here to keep you safe. You are safe. Let's breathe together. Things like that. Well, I know you were worried about this, but you did that, and sensory interventions. The hard chewing gum was a lifesaver with William. It helped him to organize. He would get where he's like, can I have my gum, please, as soon as he walked in the door. Whereas I tried that with another kid that was very much into flight, and he swallowed it. So it isn't like you have a clear cut what to do. And things that I've mentioned about movement, playing catch, jumping on a trampoline, those little trampolines, if that's available. I got that from our OT at our school. So stories sometimes are a way to talk about feelings. And that can be like, you can be very well-meaning and not be able to know what to say. And so Chandra Ghosh Ipin, who is the co-creator of the child parent psychotherapy model, is also a very gifted story writer. And this book, Once I Was Very Scared, has dialogues that describe the fight, flight, freeze response in animals in like childlike ways. So like the pictures look like this, right? So the words would be something like, someone I love left. I don't like it when people leave, and they leave a lot. People were fighting. I hid, but they kept fighting, and they went on and on. And people started yelling, and no one wanted me around. I got scared, and I sprayed, and they yelled more and more, and I sprayed more and more. And I can't remember what happened, but it was bad. I worry bad things might happen again. So it's a way to have a dialogue about the things that happened. And then there's the solutions part to it too, which covers strategies like music helps me calm down. I still like to run, but I also found a safe place where I can be calm and snuggle. I talked to my mom, and she said she was very sorry that someone hurt me, and that makes me feel much better. I will keep you safe and make sure no one ever hurts you again. So these are examples. But then there's, if you don't want to be so specific, this is a great book, The Rabbit Listened. And it really is about just being there, you know, and not giving solutions or trying to direct the dialogue. And, you know, the kid's a hot mess and the rabbit stays nearby, and, you know, the child could feel the rabbit being near. And the rabbit just listened. And then he says, please stay with me. And the rabbit listens and listens to him talk, listens to him play. They play hide and seek. They throw everything. I tell them how mad I am. And then, you know, the rabbit listens, and then he got more organized, and he was able to build his blocks again, and they had fun. So it's like the idea of being so important, because it is. Safety is treatment, and that comes from that relatedness. Calm down, kids. Sometimes it's helpful to have stuff you can access to as interventions in the moment. And every kid is different. Most kids I have worked with like Play-Doh. Glitter bottle is basically water, glitter, and food coloring, and you shake it up and then it settles. So if you're angry, you can wait till it settles, and it can be a calming visual tool. There's some websites that have things too. Manipulatives, if they like to have things in their hands. Some books. Some kids like scents. Some kids could care less. So you can have like little cotton balls with aromatherapy scents. I love pinwheels and bubbles as a way to create breathing. The hard gum that I mentioned, TheraBands. And I have found for some kids that weighted blanket is really very nice. If they feel disorganized, just having that pressure on the skin can be very organizing. So I want to end today with a loving kindness meditation, and start us out with a poem by Emily Dickinson. It's called Hope is a Thing with Feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So let's continue to turn our attention inward. I encourage you to get into a position where you feel both engaged and relaxed. And inhale up towards the sky, and exhale out and down, and think of something that makes you smile. I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable to do that, or if you prefer, find somewhere to gaze that feels right to you. For now, we're just taking a moment to pause. We've talked about a lot of things today, and we're just going to allow ourselves to feel as we feel and be as we are. I just invite you to notice right now how your body's feeling. Just notice the sensation of your feet touching the floor. What is it like to be supported by your chair? How is your back feeling? Your hips? Just let your body settle downward and be supported by your chair. Allow yourself to have a more spacious presence. I invite you to offer yourself a soothing gesture. I like my hand on my heart and my hand on my belly, just under my rib cage. But whatever you want to do that. Just notice the warmth and pressure of your hands and the breathing that's happening underneath your hands. And have the intention to offer yourself kindness and acceptance. I'm going to offer you some loving kindness affirmations that I would like you to repeat in your mind with the intention of offering kindness to yourself. May I be safe from inner and outer harm. May I be compassionate of heart. May I have clarity of mind. May I be flexible, open, and kind. May I live with ease. We would all benefit from affection and kindness, so let us offer these affirmations to us as a group. May we be safe from inner and outer harm. May we be compassionate of heart. May we have clarity of mind. May we be flexible, open, and kind. May we live with ease. Let's close with 3 deep breaths. I invite you to offer yourself greater soothing by doing longer exhales, and I'll count for us. Let's inhale and exhale. That's 1. Inhale and exhale. That's 2. Inhale and exhale. 3. When you're ready, gently open your eyes and release this practice. Thank you so much for coming today. If you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to listen and talk.
Thank you so much, Roxanne, for being here today. We have several comments in the chat thanking you for this informative training and the material that you provided us with today, as well as the mindfulness exercises that were very, very empowering. And thank you all to our participants in today's training. Thank you for the engagement in the chat as well. It was great to have you all. Here at the Family Justice Center, we serve people who are going through interpersonal violence, and we help connect them to resources in the community. So thank you all for being here today. If you have any questions, please, we have 5 minutes. You can put them in the chat and we can direct them to our expert for the day. We will be providing all training materials via email, and as well as the recording of this training. So I don't see any questions, but I see a lot of gratitude for this presentation. So thank you so much for being here, for your expertise and your time as well.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Oh, all right, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to end the meeting for today. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the sun. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.